Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And today I'm going to do something that I haven't done in a while, which is to go over some left-wing electoral strategies that are less than optimal. I'm not an anti-electoralist, despite what people have accused me of, but I am a realist, and I'm going to go through this with some basic game theory. Now, I'm not using game theory because I believe game theory is the best way to analyze the world. I actually don't. I think some kind of mixture of systems analysis plus historical materialism is probably the best way to analyze the world. And I'm not here to tell you that everything you do that involves these strategies is automatically going to fail. I'm just going to talk about why they are suboptimal. There's a lot of talk in the Democratic Socialists of America of both disciplining your electeds. There's less talk of protecting your electeds, except people who try to use it to silence internal criticism within the organization. I actually think you have a deeper problem. The re-election rate of DSA electeds is majority re-election of incumbents, but it is at a lower rate than the general re-election rate. So the election rate of the DSA incumbents is about 65% on the second term, and it gets worse on the national than the local level. But the national level has fewer people involved. So it's hard to say if those are valid statistics or not. When you only have I don't know, 7 or 8 endorsees in Congress of several hundred, it's hard to say what the percentage validity is when 2 or 3 of them get voted out. Nonetheless, if you look at all DSA electeds altogether, the re-election average is on the upper end, let's say 70%. When I actually crunched numbers, it looked somewhere between 65 and 70. And I crunched my numbers by looking at all the DSA electeds from the Socialist in Office website and looked who got reelected over time. The national average for that is 90 to 95%. And again, there's some variability there too, because it's hard to get a good foothold on all elections everywhere in the country and how to get those various data collaborated together. What that tells you, though, is not only can you not discipline electeds because they only really needed you to get over a certain threshold in a very specific community to get into office, but you also can't protect electeds. So their willingness to deal with your bullshit, frankly, is going to be lower. Now, some people just say that we should do this and back our candidates no matter what. I think that's a strategic error, and we're going to get into why. But we do need to talk about the limits of an organization, particularly an organization that is regionally concentrated in 2 specific regions, which is California and New York, mostly in 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City, excluding, for some reason that I don't entirely understand, the Bronx. And I want to talk about this to make 2 game theoretical points and problems. One is that you have a principal agent problem. Ooh. And 2 is that you have a problem with internal incentives. This is beyond programmatic unity or anything like that, which you've talked about in the past of why I prefer it. But you have to get into how you generate a program, where the program comes from, how it's responsible. Does it merge socialists with their class base? Is that possible in your current society? And how would you do that? Those are all questions beyond the scope of what we're going to answer today, although we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about strategic leverage. One, I've said that popularity is not the same as leverage. There are very popular politicians who never get anything done because they don't have internal leverage either within their party or with external groups, despite their broad popularity on social media, within specific movements, etc., etc. If you look at DSA candidates as a whole, they have a crap track record on actually getting policies implemented. They're really kind of a small coterie to do that, and they often did so at trade-offs to their legitimacy during the Biden administration. Think about AOC and the negotiation on unions, and yes, some of the unions wanted to work with her, but it was directly, some of the union leadership wanted to work with her, but it was directly against the vote of the union itself. And defaulting to union leadership wishes when you have a vote that goes in the other direction is not entirely honest, and it's not entirely democratic, even within the terms of the union. But beyond that, you have bigger things like some of the stuff she pulled during the Biden administration about speakers in reference to Gaza, the Democratic Convention, et cetera, where she perpetuated some untruths. I'm not going to say she lied. I don't know what she knew or did not know, but it was very clear that the whole thing that they were brokering a backdoor deal was not happening in the Gaza situation. Now, her endorsement was revoked by the DSA. It seems like it's coming back, but nonetheless, there's been a lot of debates about endorsees because it seems like a very tiny splinter of a chapter put a voting guide more or less endorsing Tom Steiger in California, the private equity billionaire, who's also been more or less endorsed by the Our Revolution-based PACs. And I want to point out the systemic problems of this, because while the DSA can get people into office and get them over a certain threshold to get into office, there's only two markets where they actually are a significant part of a political program, and that is, and I say markets for a reason, that is for the 5 boroughs in New York and possibly elements of Chicago and a little bit of elements of the greater LA area. They are not strong as a force in politics anywhere else. There have been mayors that the DSA has endorsed, and there's been talks of other endorsements in Maine, etc. And a lot of the people that we even lose a lot of sleep over whether or not we're endorsing, such as Graham Plattner, haven't even really, for my knowledge, thought out DSA endorsement. So it's hard to say even what counts. And I would also say the national has stricter rules for endorsing than local chapters do. And the amount of autonomy local chapters have can be confusing about who is endorsing whom and how. All that aside, in a game theoretical context, the relationship between a voter or even a donor and a political candidate is monitored as a principal agent problem. When you endorse a candidate whom you cannot discipline by withholding votes or funds, you effectively eliminate your credible threat to their position, leading to a systemic breakdowns in a strategic game of leverage in politics, of which popularity is only one element of, and in and of itself is not leverage. So even if the DSA helps make candidates popular, gives them their media background, gives them talking points, there's a very obvious strategic logic to them often forgoing caring about what the DSA thinks further down the line, even if they're cadres, because the DSA, except in very limited places, like maybe New York, does not have the size and density in a given area. I'm not talking about the size relative to the left, which is what people always focus on. Like, yes, the DSA is the largest leftist organization since the Socialist Party of America. That's irrelevant. They are concentrated primarily in 4 of the 5 boroughs in New York. I'm going to keep on saying that. And in progressive cities. And their track record is middling. Their policy record is even worse. When you cannot protect a candidate, you also cannot discipline him. And people like David Griscom, who had yelled at the left of the DSA for trying to discipline electeds before they could protect them, actually do have a point. But the problem that you have if you're trying to protect them without any set standards of what is a minimum of engagement other than seeking your endorsement is that you have no real clear criteria for withdrawing your endorsement other than democratic fiat, so people don't know how to comply, and you can't really help them anyway because canvassing is really good for new candidates and might matter a little bit for getting incumbents reelected, but it matters less. What matters for incumbents is the ability to stave off money threats. And that changes the calculus of what the DSA can do profoundly, because not just does the DSA not have a ton of money beyond its operational capacity, because it spends, its members' dues pretty much to operate. And it's really transparent about that. It's pretty fair about that. But this leads us to another problem, though, because it is a political nonprofit, it's an advocacy group. It is limited in how much money it can give to a candidate. Just period. I think there is a cap of several $1,000s. I think it's around 7 to 10. And the DSA does give those kind of grants out, but that cannot compete with other forms of PAC money. And the DSA does not have its own PAC. Its PACs are things downstream of like Leaders We Deserve, Our Revolution, et cetera, and when someone comes into power, the DSA will often, what they do, and you see this with the Mandani campaign, is set up a separate PAC because they're going to need funds in other ways, which also means that DSA candidates locally are going to be dependent on the larger Democratic Party structure in the same donor structure as everybody else. That's a problem. So in a standard bargaining game, your power is derived from the best alternative to negotiated agreement. And this is often shortened in game theory to BATNA. It is not just a number. It is a strategic action plan that says what you will do if you walk away. A stronger BATNA gives you confidence, allowing you to reject deals that do not meet your needs. And you probably do need to have a criterion for what your needs are before you even go about this. So any offer should be compared to your best alternative to walking away. If the proposed agreement is worse than walking away, you should walk away. This is why I don't vote for endorsements when I get a chance to, not just in my DSA chapter, but in my union, although I don't get a chance to in my union because my union's PAC does not actually have representatives voting on who they endorse. It is a leadership decision and consulting with the listservs are the people who are hired to be lobbyists. So there are common pitfalls to a BATNA, and I will say that there are 3 of them. One is disclosing your weakness, as it removes your negotiating power. And like with the dirty break, for example, saying the conditions of the dirty break remove the ability to do a dirty break, but also saying that you won't do a dirty break at a time of crisis, such as Republicans in power. You are also saying that you're not a threat to any long-term Democratic Party strategic goals or in anything. Actually, it's not just talking about this in terms of political parties. To disclose your unwillingness to walk away is to remove your negotiating power. To say that you will not unendorse a candidate is to say that a candidate can do whatever the fuck they want. The other thing that you can do, though, is that mistake your BATNA uh, for what will cause you to work away, like not saying it. So, you know, if you're bad at negotiating in bazaars or with a used car dealership, which I actually notoriously am, believe it or not, even though I understand this, you're going to be bad at the game of politics with people you endorse, because the issue is not the enemy. The issue is the ally who you cannot control. But the other thing you must remember is that discipline also should come with protection, which is why I often think a lot of what the DSA does to generate hype is actually self-defeating, because you can generate the hype, get the hype game going, but the moment that you can't deliver, you don't really have clear status to walk away, and it's not clear that there's anything binding to make that clear. I mean, there are like binding resolutions about Palestine and stuff that DSA has passed that electeds have stepped afoul of, but there's also this constant push even within the organization not to pull on those things because you may have gotten some gains and not others. This is a game theoretical mistake, though, because it's based off of vagueness and also too many people at too many levels being able to negotiate what is and is not an endorsement and how much that sounds. And endorsements for the DSA actually mean more than endorsements from other organizations. No one asked me to do anything or canvas or do a whole lot for union stuff for a candidate. They will ask me to do it for issues around the candidate, but they don't ask me to go around door knocking for candidates. The DSA does. Which means that their endorsements are to act as if this person is a party organ, even though the DSA is legally not a party, doesn't function like one, and can't function like one as long as it's under its current tax code status. So this is a confusion that a lot of people have. If the price of your endorsement is always paid regardless of your candidate's actions, so as your endorsement comes before a candidate's actions and you are scared to withdraw it because you will lose power if you unendorse popular candidates, your candidate has no incentive to keep buying your support with policy concessions, or even to keep buying your support by pushing your policy promises. This is called capture. It is being known as a captured constituency. When people talk about elite capture, they're often being misleading, but this is somewhat true. The candidate will rationally ignore your interests if you focus on median voters or swing donors or anything else whose support is actually contingent on a candidate's behavior, not yours. And if you say that your support is unconditional because you have endorsed, or only semi-conditional, or if you don't have clear criterion for which endorsement is actually there other than the whims of your group has not agreed democratically to what those criterions are, just that you agree that this candidate sounds good to you, you actually have made it unclear what the conditions are for defection. So even if someone wants to keep you in their constituency, it's actually hard for them to do. And if you can't provide protection, why should they do it? Now, two, there's another problem here. This leads to moral hazard and information asymmetry. When a candidate cannot be disciplined, there is a state of moral hazard. The candidate, who from the standpoint of game theory is an agent, takes a risk or moves away from your preferred policy positions, which we often refer to as shrinking in game theory, because they know the voter or voter bloc, the principal, will bear the cost of those decisions without being able to punish the agent. So the DSA will lose face if their endorsed candidates don't follow the DSA's platforms, but the DSA may not be able to hurt the candidate because they're not enough of the candidate's constituency overall to do anything about it. And they also don't have a robust enough donor process to offset it with money, which the Democratic Party and the DNC and the various things around that, whatever you like or dislike about it, do, although they have less than they used to. So, if a candidate aligns with your goals, you have an incentive to ensure reelection and funding if you are able to protect and discipline. Retrospective voting, which is punishing past behavior, is a form of accountability, signaling that your vote communicates specific policy demands and that can be withdrawn in the future can matter too, as even sitting on your hands can be something that is giving you a strategic advantage in this negotiation. An endorsement is a negotiation. Even when it's cadres, the organization is negotiating with the individual. If the organization acts as the voter or the principal, and the agent could do whatever the hell they want without bearing any of that cost, they're going to do it. It is irrational to expect they're going to do it. And that means that what you're looking at in terms of wins is just getting people into office and not following up on policy. And who cares about getting people to office if they don't do what you want? Now, if you don't have the ability to get that far, you have a legitimate argument that is often made between the quote left of the DSA and the quote right of the DSA about how to come to terms with this. But I actually want to point out that this was very different from the way electoralism was used in other forms of socialist history, even with the SPD until around 1914, and definitely with the Bolsheviks and their electoral runs when they could do them, when they weren't suppressed and underground prior. What they were trying to do was illustrate that they had power and some popularity and constituency and could obstruct things from happening in the government with that, but they did not try to run a government which they did not control. Even in coalition with other parties, and even in the Bolshevik case, they didn't accept that after the Civil War. So there you go. That's a very different thing than trying to do entryism and use that with strategic leverage when you are in a party system that requires very little internal buy-in. The American party system, because of the way we use it to sort primaries and candidates, is basically just a sorting figure for ideologies that are fluid anyway, and have very low stakes to declare yourself part of this larger identity group. Whereas a party like traditional socialist parties, or even what the DSA tries to do, is requires more skin in the game, such as regular payments to be a member, even if they're relatively low, $3 or $4 a month or whatever. Expectation and participation in at least virtual forms of meetings, if not actual meetings, in order to verify your vote, et cetera, et cetera. That means that the one organization is going to have very different rules than the other, because the other is an active participant democracy, which the DSA is, whereas the DANC is a private corporation that is actively participating in democracy, but is not actually beheld to democratic norms beyond the laws around it, since it is not an official government structure. It is kind of an unofficial one that laws have codified. This leads to what we might call, though, an iterated prisoner's dilemma, when you actually try to run something you can't entirely control, like the DSA trying to influence the Democratic Party to split it apart, which is what the DSA's nominal partyist wing, which is now the dominant wing in the organization, wants to do. Although, if the partyist wing is still the dominant wing in the organization after all the entries into the orgs after Mondani is an open question, and we will see that in the future. But nonetheless, politics is not a one-shot game, and in a country without term limits for certain things, it is an iterated game paid over many, many, many election cycles, which is my point about the excitement the DSA can give you at getting into office versus what it can give you when you're in office, which is a very, very different thing. And this model was already illustrated before the DSA was really what it is today by the problems with progressive organizers and Barack Obama, who were told that they were going to lead this great ground game, but Obama didn't need them when they actually got into office, and he didn't use them either. Why? Because the ground game's less important when you're an incumbent. Just strategically. Again, I am not making moral judgments. I am not relying on my normal Marxist analysis. I am just explaining to you the game strategic problems with what is being done and where they come from, and why you might want a bunch of fresh-faced canvassers and low commitment donors early on. It matters a lot less as an incumbent when you're actually in power, given the structure of American Republican democracy. Small r, small d, both in questionable state today, if they've ever mattered as words. So when you have an iterated game, you play it over many cycles. In an iterated game, the most effective strategy is for cooperation is a tit for tat strategy, cooperating when the player cooperates and defecting when they defect. It works because it disciplines and protects. When they do what you want, you are with them. When they don't do what they want, you leave. Over retaliation tends to lose. It tends to lose badly, actually, and no retaliation also tends to lose. If you remove the ability to defect, to deny votes or funds because you think you are building a permanent power base, your strategy is actually one of permanent cooperation. In game theory, a player who always cooperates regardless of what the other player's move is easily exploited. In fact, it's generally one of the worst strategies you can do. So as a strategy to affect the Democratic Party, it will not work if you will not criticize, which signals the possibility of defection, and defect when things matter. Now, the thing is, though, you need some sort of mechanism, program, whatever, for deciding what is a threshold for what you consider an actual defection and what is just a strategic limitation that you don't want to punish. And that is where there's a lot of room for debate. That's where a lot of the left and the right of the DSA really disagree. But ultimately, though, if there's never a case where you're willing to punish defection, even if someone goes against your plank, even if someone takes money, even if someone outright lies to you, not to the general public, to you, then you are a sucker in the game. You are a useless principle because you will bear the cost of the agent's defection. Period. As a game strategic way to approach things, it's really dumb. But the other thing it does is it leads to rent seeking, sunk cost, and path dependency. And these are worse than the other things I talked about. When discipline and protection is removed from the equation of endorsement, the relationship shifts from a contract, which is part of the cadre deal, to rent seeking. A candidate views your support as political rent. They may even join your organization to get that political rent, which is a guaranteed return regardless of whether there is no productive effort past the initial attempt to get your endorsement. Furthermore, if you've already spent significant social capital endorsing them, you may fall victim to sunk cost fallacies, which will make you continue to give them support and money after they have broken your trust. But since they will give you words of affirmation and ways to get more rents from you in the terms of support, free labor, etc., you will continue to support an undisciplined candidate, not because it's an optimal strategy, but because you have to justify the resources you've already invested and the fact you've attached your fate into theirs, even though you bear most of the cost of their defections from your program. From a game theoretic perspective, support without the threat of withdrawal is not a transaction, it is a gift. And a gift will make you a slave. To quote Claude Levi-Strauss, in a competitive arena of political economy, gifts are consumed, but they rarely buy long-term leverage or influence. They might buy you short-term goodwill, but the moment you try to influence without those other considerations, you'll actually probably get more pushback than if you were regularly aligning on a tit for tat basis. Now, part of the problem with aligning on tit for tat basis is the 4-year one-time election cycle thing where you don't get to do recalls or whatever just because they dissatisfied your group. And if you're not a party, you also don't get to revoke, party caucuses and stuff like that. So your other ways of disciplining, which the larger party has, they can discipline by removing committees. They can discipline by cutting funds to your district. They can discipline by all kinds of ways that you don't have as the DSA or as an individual progressive activist. Without the ability to impose costs for a candidate for noncompliance, a voter, a donor, or an influence group, which the DSA still is, even though they want to be a party and sometimes call themselves a party prematurely, ceases to be a player in the game and becomes a utility harvest. Now, if we want to think about this in terms of class struggle, mass line politics, and the nature of power, we have to ask ourselves a couple of things. One, Maoist theory, for example, tends to emphasize the political power does not come from the ballot box, but comes from the ability to mobilize the masses and exert physical or economic force. It's not the ballot or the bullet; it's the production or the bullet, or the hammer and hoe or the bullet. Many people of this persuasion would argue that endorsing a candidate you cannot discipline is a form of liberal tailism, and I would tend to agree with them. This is also what ML should say, and what even social democrats should say. The practice of following the elite of bourgeois parties in order to try to steal their constituency by speaking up to popular points within those parties instead of providing real alternative leadership is a problem. And the problem is by endorsing without discipline, you are essentially begging for crumbs. In this view, if you don't have an independent organization with a mass base and the ability to act in multiple fields of action, both economic, political, and even militia if need be, you don't have a way of disciplining candidate and keeping them responsible even to their constituency, much less to you, and thus you have no real power. From the masses to the masses, which is another Maoist slogan of the mass line, and the mass line is more complicated than just popularity amongst the masses, which is the way it's often used wrongly. But endorsing an undisciplined candidate is often viewed as right opportunism. And the reason why it is because it sacrifices long-term goals and even revolutionary principles for short-term gains in terms of parliamentary politics. It's not that parliamentary politics isn't something you should be doing. It's that parliamentary politics is just a tactical thing to consider. It is not even a strategic thing, much less a principled thing. If your goal are policy changes that would reform things significantly, which, by the way, most policy changes are not even reformism. Reformism requires a change in form. They are what we might call tinkering. But even if you want those as a way to make more revolutionary headway, and if you want to see like non-reform reforms or whatever dumb fucking inconsequential names people come up with, you do that in a more complicated way than just trying to tail progressive talking points, get some workerist candidates in there, and then flip a switch. Which is why even good candidates should be viewed skeptically, and why having parasocial relationships with candidates you can't vote for but are willing to give money to makes you a real sucker, because you have no leverage if you are just as an individual, not as a group, giving money to candidates you can't even fucking vote for. They have every incentive to want your money, but you have no discipline mechanism over them. It's dumb. Don't do it. But anyway, structural capture and individual discipline. The inability to discipline isn't just a tactical error. It's a feature of bourgeois democracy. The state is not a neutral playground for game theory. It has a class character. A candidate in a capitalist system is structurally disciplined by capital, donors, markets, the military-industrial complex, the media, as well as its own party apparatus. if the masses cannot protect the candidate and they cannot discipline the candidate, capital can, and then the candidate is effectively an agent of capital regardless of their personal rhetoric or even their personal sincerely held beliefs. This is important. Now, a political endorsement without the teeth of discipline could be said to be a paper tiger. It looks like participation in power. It looks like you're winning by getting people in office, but it has no substance in policy or even long-term strategic goals. It serves only to legitimize a system that's fundamentally hostile to the interests of the laboring classes and the working class in particular. The analysis would conclude that trying to optimize a losing game, the focus should be on building subjective forces, the organization of the power of the people, that makes discipline possible through spikes, boycotts, and independent political action, so that they can correlate when ejected forces happen, which is crises in the subjectivity of the bourgeoisie from economic failure, military failure, inability to perform policies, no basis for their policies, etc. The current electoral strategy, often characterized by the dirty break of the party surrogate model, diverges from this in a lot of key ways, but it also diverges from Karl Kasky's pre-1917 Erfurtian strategy in several ways too. And I want to talk about that before we move on. So if I use a kind of Maoist model, which I've been talking a lot about lately, you can see there's a problem. But if I use the Erfurtian model or the classical social democratic model of the pre-1914 Second International, we still have a problem. While both prioritize parliamentary work, they differ on the nature of class independence, the function of the party, and even their end strategic goal. One, the most glaring difference between what the SPD and the Kasky was doing was strict organizational and electoral independence was a non-negotiable principle of class struggle politics. The SPD never ran candidates on ballot lines of bourgeois parties. They never joined with other parties. They would not even serve in governments with them until after 1917. Kasky argued that a party must appear to be to the working class as a distinct independent force. The goal was to build a state within a state. The dirty breakup party surrogate line, where the DSA runs candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line, subjects you to Democratic Party politics. It is not independent. This is justified as a tactical necessity due to the undemocratic nature of the U.S. two-party system, and fair to you. But the undemocratic nature of the German Reich is pretty well established, whereas Kalki would tell you the blockism and ministerialism, which was collaborating in bourgeois governments, was a betrayal of socialist principles until the 1920s when he did it in the Weimar period. And, when he sometimes did it with the Ebert government. There's also a difference between the strategy of overflow and the strategy of attrition. Which should be very clear. For Kasky, elections were not just about winning policy concessions. They were a tool to measure the growth of the proletariat shock force. That's part of why you did it. It wasn't just to win seats, at least not before 1914. Every election was a census of this movement's strength. He believed that when socialists reached majority, the legal state would effectively collapse or be forced to yield by the real power of the proletariat. Some wings of the DSA actually do believe in this. Some of the Marxist-Leninist caucuses, some of even the left adjacent caucuses do this. But much of the actual practice is geared towards legislative policy wonkism or legislative reformism. And this is interesting because success is often measured by passion-specific bills or by moving the Overton window to talk about such bills in the Democratic Party. We're not even going to talk about success measured in passion-specific bills because, frankly, the DSA has not done it. But they have changed the Overton window between the Democratic Party. Rather than using elections to build disciplined, independent counterstates and movements for total rupture, it's not even to total rupture within the state. It's not even total rupture within the Democratic Party because conditions of that rupture are never spelled clean. when I ask people what would it take for you to actually do the dirty break, it's always pushed off to when there's no right-wing counterforce to the Democrats, which will never fucking happen. So, the legislative reformism has a different goal. You hear about this with non-reformist reforms and other such paradoxical nonsensories. Kautsky's strategy is also rooted in the Erfurt program, which has divided goals into a minimum program, which was immediate reforms, maybe also immediate demands, which were even more pressing than the minimum program, and a maximum program, which was not fully stated, but was the socialization of the means of production. Not just the nationalization either, the socialization. Candidates were strictly disciplined by the party program. There was no individual. A candidate was a mouthpiece for the collective party's will and was held to it. The DSA likes a centralized discipline to enforce this on anyone in the Democratic Party. They can't break committees. They can't do electoral discipline. They don't have the money to money discipline. And they're not as necessary beyond getting someone into office initially strategically. Because many DSA officials are technically elected as Democrats, most of them, they are subjected to discipline of the Democratic House and Senate leadership. Such as when parts of the squad are voting for the rail strike and military funding, and so they back off. So this creates a principal agent problem that we talked about earlier that Kautsky's model was designed to prevent through total separation. Kautsky didn't know about game theory, but they knew about how parliaments worked. Marx knew about this too and was always threatening to discipline the SPD by leaving, although he never pulled that trigger as their foreign representative when they would threaten to sit on bourgeois governments, etc. Kautsky believed in the inevitable growth of the socialist vote until it reached 51%, and he thought this would happen because the expansion of the industrial proletariat in particular. That never happened in Germany, and that's its own special problem. But the goal was, once that happened, the Socialist Party would take power and even dissolve the standing army. DSA, by contrast, operates in a more fragmented environment. Rather than a single conscious bloc, the DSA acts legally as a pressure group and actually as a pressure group within a broader progressive coalition within a broader party. It seeks to influence the working class base of the Democratic Party, which is also questionable which parts of the working class base are in the Democratic Party, how they're strategically downstream of progressives, what the federal limits on that are. I'm not even getting into the limits of dealing with federalism when you want to abolish the Senate and the judiciary, but you can't even take several states at a time. Rather than drawing out the base into a separate antagonistic organizational structure. Kautsky would likely argue that by utilizing Democratic BATNA, the Democratic Party, DSA is not building a party in the shell deal, but instead risking being captured by providing energy for the bourgeois party without the ability to discipline the candidates that helps elect and without having a clear program that is not implemented by a party that is independent. Now, this is its own special issue, but it is a real issue. We're going to end here, and on the next part of this series, I'm going to talk about path dependency problems that emerge and all this. And I don't just want to pick on the DSA because every group on the left has path dependency problems, including non-electoral ones. We need to talk about this, pull this out, and deal with it. And on that note, I'll end here. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more on the Patreon for as little as $4, and have a great day.